It says we're live. Hang on. Hello and welcome to the Big Book Club. This month, well, the last 2 months, we read the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoree Fannone Jeffers, and I read that with Ebony Kane, who is here today to talk to you about this. So if you don't know, if you're new, I don't know why you'd be here, but if you are, the Big Book Club is a book club where we read books over 500 pages. The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois was our pick for April and May. And for June and July, we will be reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. And I'll be reading that with Milena Reeds. So, Ebony, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about your channel, what books you normally read, and your favourite big book as well?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ebony Kane, and I post content on YouTube. I love reading literary fiction, poetry, and occasional memoirs. And my favorite big book, this might be a spoiler, but I would say it's probably this one. And for reasons that you'll hear about shortly.
Yeah.
I'm getting the third question. What was it?
That was it. I think your favourite big book was
Perfect.
So yeah, that's good. Okay, so the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois is kind of an intergenerational family saga, but it really focuses on one woman throughout her life, Ailey, and she is growing up in the American South in Georgia in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And at the same time, it tells the story of her family, her sisters, her mother, particularly the women in her family. And interspersed throughout are songs which tell the story of her family much further back in the past, from her Indigenous ancestors, her enslaved African ancestors, and the white ancestors as well, all of them, and how they all interact, kind of telling a story of American history through the perspective of this one family. So you said it was your favourite. Obviously, you've liked it. Would you want to give us an overview? What were the reasons that you loved it so much?
Sure. So I felt as though this novel was such a kind of all-encapsulating aspect of the Black experience in America. And as an African American, I felt like a lot of the stories and things that were represented here were also evident in my family, and from what I've heard from like my grandmother and grandparents living in the South. And just in terms of the craft aspect of this, I have such respect for the author, because I can tell that she did so much research and so much went into crafting the story and considering like the political aspects of it and the traumatic aspects of it, and doing it in such a way that felt grounded through Ailey's story and through her family's story. I just really, really respect the, I guess, ambition behind the author. And I think she achieved what she set out to do in a very, very skilled way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Throughout it, there were quotes from Du Bois, but also from other authors and things. I particularly noticed Zora Neale Hurston quotes throughout, which makes sense considering like she's like famous for using the vernacular of the American South, particularly Florida, in her writing. And I think that there was a feeling a bit of Hurston. It reminded me of it in terms of like dialogue and things. I thought that she was clearly using like intertextuality with the like great American novels of Black authors, was a big part of what I think came through in the style in terms of the way that she was writing for me, which I enjoyed, as well as the humour, I think. When I read works by Irish writers, because my parents are Irish, there's a particular sense of humour that I really notice with Irish writers, and I think that the same might be true for like African American writers. There is this specific type of humour from that's like a cultural reference and a way of comfortably talking that I think really shone through this book. Because whilst there is a lot of trauma in this book, there is also a lot of like love and humour that I think worked really well. I think that the trauma narrative is something that also came up for me when I was reading this. I've seen a lot of discussion, a lot of discourse around the idea of African American writers having to write trauma narrative in order to be published or to be lauded with awards. And there was a lot of trauma in this book, particularly from like halfway to 3/4 of the way through. I was really struggling to get through it because it is so dark. And obviously, as you said, it's like it's interacting with African American history, and that's like a true and honest way of writing. But what did you think about the trauma narrative and how that interacts with the writing?
So this question is very layered because there were so many different forms of violence presented in the story.
Mm-hmm.
In so many different ways. There was systemic violence, there was physical violence, emotional violence, and relating back to your thought of the trauma narrative and, traditionally Black writers, even women writers, queer writers, they all get these awards and accolades for some reason if their book has that traumatic or element of trauma presented in the story. I think in this case, it was necessary, and because it really shows the true experiences. And I too saw a lot of discourse of, was it too much? The layered, very, very dark stories being presented. And to go back to your point of joy and love still being present, I think it, for me, balanced out well because there were times where I was cringing and it was a very challenging read. It was not an easy book to read, an easy narrative to read, but I think stories like these are important because, once again, you shouldn't feel comfortable with slavery happening. And it shouldn't be this kind of like washed over. And there were some characters like Rebecca who were in the story of like, oh, well, like it was all love and they took care of children that weren't theirs. And it's like, no, the reality was that they were assaulted and they were beaten and, all of the things that happened. So I think to not have had this in this type of narrative would have been a bit of a disservice. Although, once again, it is like, it's not easy to read at all. And your heart breaks for the characters. And I think of like Lydia and Ailey and everything that they went through, even within their family.
Yeah.
And I think it was interesting too how Jeffers decided to kind of intertwine like Ailey and her sister's trauma with past relatives and like this kind of like ancestral link to trauma and how we face it, how our bodies hold it. So, and once again, it's unfortunate, but I think it was, necessary for the type of story that this novel tells.
Yeah. I think Lydia's part was actually the hardest for me to read. Even though there were lots of brutal, horrible things going on in all parts of the story, there was something about the hopelessness of it that I found really difficult because in terms of the enslaved people, it's horrible and it's hard to read, but it is. With Lydia, there was a way out. She could have got out of that situation, which is not true for enslaved people, whereas Lydia, she could have been okay. She could have come out of it. And I think that's why it was harder for me personally to read, was that I kept hoping for something for her that she didn't get. Which was tough to read.
I would agree. I also was holding out hope that something would change or that she would, I don't know, but yeah. And it's sad because, especially considering the time period of Lydia's story, drug use and drug abuse was very, very prevalent at that time. And people really didn't understand, the consequences. And I think that was her case. She just kind of got mixed up into it. But yeah, it was tough. Her story was very, very tough, even with her and Dante. Like his story too, it was just, it was tough.
Yeah, even when what happened when he died, I was like, he's making it up. That Tim guy is making it up, and it's going to come back. because he was like not a nice person. So I thought that something was gonna happen, but yeah, it was difficult to read.
Absolutely. And even just how Lydia responded to that situation, I think,
Mhm.
if I'm remembering correctly, she is the oldest daughter. She's the
Yeah.
eldest.
Hmm.
So she immediately went into that mode of, I need to tend to his grieving mother and put my feelings aside,
Hmm.
which is what she always did, especially with Ailey and the trauma that they suffered, at the
Hmm.
hands of their grandfather. It
Hmm.
was just kind of always in protection mode, or in, I'm going to push my feelings aside and I'm going to help, this person next to me who
Yeah.
she felt as though needed her love and attention more than
Hmm.
herself.
I think that seemed to be another theme that came through was women enduring terrible things, and instead of talking about it or finding support within each other, like closing down and protecting everyone else through that. But because even like their mother, her experiences, um, but it just made her stricter with her children when she found out like Lydia had been groomed into that relationship with a 34-year-old man, and she was just like very strict with her. And I guess it was the 80s or the 90s when that happened, so there are different standards then, I suppose, as well as to how you would react with that. But it felt like there was a lot of that throughout the narrative, throughout it, of because it is focused on the women, but sort of this idea of stoicism and strength, and the way that that actually can be harmful to yourself as an individual, and can cause you to continue the cycles of trauma throughout your life because you don't share or open up, which I felt like was interesting, contrasting with the theme of storytelling. Like there was this theme of women not telling their stories, but also this theme of storytelling. Like I particularly noticed the first line of the narrative says, well, not the first line, but in the beginning it says, "We knew her before she was born. We sang her into her mother's womb. We sang then and we sing now," which reminded me of like Greek epics, like "Sing to me, muse of the rage of Peleus' son Achilles." This idea of like singing a story. And it introduces this book as it's going to be an epic narrative, like as important a story as Odysseus, or as big and a founding story, in the same way that those ancient Greek ones are. And then there's a bit later on where it says, when the Yankee comes down to Matthew, when he comes down, and it says, "As a New Englander, Matthew didn't understand that well-bred Southerners craved stories." And there's a repetition throughout the book of this idea of storytelling, particularly towards the end when oral narrative, oral history telling comes back around, and these stories are told.
Absolutely. And I think the tradition of oral history, particularly for, Indigenous Americans, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly for African Americans, and enslaved people, was the only way that they could keep track of their family history.
Mm-hmm.
They could not and were not allowed to document. They couldn't even read or write, a lot of them.
Yeah.
So to have the importance of oral history emphasized through this. And you're absolutely right. And since I finished reading the book not too long ago today,
Mm-hmm.
I saw even at the end of the book that theme too, where I'm forgetting the exact quote and the exact page, but the narrator states that, once again, good Southerners love, or well-bred Southerners love a story.
Mm-hmm.
And even the tradition of like the houses on the South, and like how important a porch is,
Mm-hmm.
and how people sit there and they tell their stories to each other. And it is a really interesting juxtaposition to the stories that are withheld,
Mm-hmm.
and what knowing and unknowing, or kind of the lack of knowledge, does to certain characters about,
Mm-hmm.
their family history. And even going back to Ailey at the end interviewing Uncle Roo and her grandmother, and having that as a record, and even the Franklins. I don't know. I agree. And this beautiful thing of songs and ancestry, and kind of like a spiritual, it felt like, like if we think back to spirituals, in the time of slavery for enslaved African Americans, that was their symbol of hope. That was their way of, surviving to the
Mm-hmm.
next day. So carrying that throughout the novel too, I I think that's what makes it for me such a great story, is that
Mhm.
it really considers the many different ways that we pass history through, generations.
Yeah. I mean, even the title is the Love Songs of
Mhm.
W.E.B. Du Bois, and so it's about songs as stories and about love as well throughout the book. I think those are the two things that I think it's trying to focus on, even with all these moments of darkness and not love and violence and aggression throughout, particularly sexual violence. There was a lot of sexual violence in this book, which of course is always difficult to read. Um, but I thought it's an interesting choice that sexual violence within the family is like a repeated theme throughout the book. It's a theme, a sort of trauma that carries on throughout this story, and the shame and the hiding of sexual violence within the family, which obviously is even harder to read about because it is within the family. But the fallout of sexual violence as well. There's a lot about sort of home breeding. What is it? Home training? Is that the correct word?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and how that stops people from being able to, like, having to accept this violence because of your home training, because of your respective elders or people whose houses you're in, or things like that. I thought it did a very subtle job of showing the violence of things like how home training can perpetuate violence. I thought it was interesting.
Absolutely. And that is something that, I think back to with even within my own family. Um, in the South, particularly, like, you're always taught to respect your elders and you have to respond in a certain way. And even now, I'm just thinking back to my own childhood memories. There would be, for eating a family dinner and you're around elders, as a child, you were separated from that discussion, or it would
Mhm,
always be like, this is grown folks' business. Like, you
mhm,
shouldn't be listening to this. And kind of that hushness and secrets, and just kind of, once again, because it's also in a way about keeping up appearances
mhm,
and making sure that although whatever is happening internally inside of your family, you can maintain a certain image outwardly that we
mhm,
are kind of put together and we are respectable, which of course now is dismantling with therapy. But at that time it wasn't really accepted, and it was just a way that families kind of dealt with what was going on within their units. And
mhm,
it's not right at all, and it is what kept Ailey and Lydia from even telling their mother what was going
mhm,
on, because of that fear and that respectability and kind of that just desire to keep things secret and
mhm.
close.
Yeah. And there was a lot of repetition about the idea of being like a good, nice girl throughout
Mhm.
different characters, through their mother and Ailey and Lydia as well. There was this idea of them, they should be good, nice girls, and if they weren't nice girls, then they were ruined. Like, it was very black and white in terms of the way their virtue was seen. But as we can see through all of the men in this book, these men are not very nice men most of the time. They're like not shit. Like, even their dad, who is like nice most of the time, he's still a cheater. Like, he's still like leaves their mum for a bit and then comes back. Like,
Oh my
it
god, I know.
only Uncle Root is a nice man. He's the only man in the whole book.
I'm an Uncle Root stan. I love him. He was my favorite. Like, I loved him so much. And you're right. It was all of that. But, it was interesting too to see how the women dealt with these men. Like,
Mm,
these men who were just terrible to them. I think it was Ailey's mom telling a story about like a guy who basically tried to force himself onto her, and she lied, and
mhm,
just how they turn things and make it into a way where they reclaim their narrative, and
mhm,
whatever is happening to them. They're very strong women. I noticed
mm.
in the novel, just how they dealt with and the things that they dealt with. I don't really think, it would be hard to survive those things and to
Yeah.
reclaim those things and be kind of unashamed in certain ways surrounding
Mm.
them.
Yeah, they definitely within the power that they had, they used it in like
Mhm.
intelligent ways. They knew how to work the system, or to throw a pan of hot grits at a man until he was burnt and couldn't visit his mistress.
Yes, and this is a thing. Oh my goodness, I can't tell you how many times. Not that I like heard of that actually happening, but it would
Mhm.
be. It's kind of like a saying a little bit, like,
Okay.
oh, if he's stepping out, like he's gonna get hot grits on him. Like it's been a thing in the South. Yeah, it's so interesting, like just culturally.
Hmm.
That so to have once again that story reflected in the novel was kind of
Mm.
I'm like, oh, okay. Like I've heard my grandparents talking about something like this happening before. So it was
You
pretty
have
interesting.
you have Southern family.
I do. So both my maternal and paternal grandparents were born in the South,
Mhm.
at from the Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then from Virginia. So they grew up in a Jim Crow South,
Mhm.
and particularly on my maternal grandfather's side, they are historians in their own ways, and they have cultivated like documents and books of family history. Um, so it's really, yeah. So even just there's a museum in DC, and it's an African American history museum. I'm forgetting the exact name of it, but I went there with my grandmother, and just seeing like certain things, she would be like, "Oh yes, like this is true. Like we experienced this. Like I couldn't
Mhm.
go to the same doctor, or I had to go only at certain times." So in certain ways, the story felt very real to me because I
Mhm.
could see my relatives telling these stories, and even the ways in which they tell stories of their ancestors. It's through oral history because
Mhm.
once again, those are the documents, like I have had family members struggling to find birth certificates because they weren't well documented
Yeah.
in the past.
So I can see why this book specifically would like personally resonate for you, with family of
Absolutely.
historians as well. It's
Mhm.
interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I had something to ask and I can't remember what it was. Uh, this book actually wasn't what I expected going into it, having read the synopsis about what it would be like, because it talks in the synopsis about this girl dreaming of her maternal ancestors. She really only dreams of one maternal ancestor, the indigenous woman who was a Creek woman that was her great 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 grandmother, I think is how, and who worked in the house where her African ancestors were enslaved. Um, but she doesn't. I imagined that it would be more dream based, and I was
Mm.
interested to see the way that dreams and ghosts would interplay with this book, because I think that's something that I've always personally found quite interesting in fiction. In fact, there's a book by Narlo Hopkinson called The Salt Roads, which is in Haiti, and it has a lot of like dreams and ghosts in it. I thought it would be more similar to that, but it was actually much more focused on this family history in the late part of the 20th century, which is not what I was expecting at all. But not that that was an issue, but I just found it interesting the way that it was advertised, and I wonder if that has to do with like the popularity of intergenerational family sagas, like A Homegoing or Pachinko, all those sorts of novels that do really well. Because I'm not really I don't normally read intergenerational family sagas. I find them, you don't get to know the characters really well. Whereas in this book, I found that the characters were like incredibly strong. I definitely felt like all of them felt very well realized. I think Ailey and Uncle Root were definitely my favorites, but I enjoyed their father and a lot of different characters I thought were really interesting. What did you think of the characters in the book?
So I also agree, and that's kind of my gripe too with reading intergenerational novels. Is I love
Mm.
sitting with characters, and I feel as though sometimes I don't have that opportunity to do so. This one though felt like I was able to really understand each character, and I loved Uncle Root so much. Like he was my absolute favorite character. I thought that he was very well fleshed out, and he really cared for Ailey, and it was nice to see, you know, a male character care so much for someone who was not his own child. And
Mm,
although that was his niece, but he still took her underneath him as if she were his own.
mhm,
And I also really liked Ailey as well. I thought her character was very well developed. Even as we followed her through her life as this very shy and quiet young girl to then, growing, coming of age, and really becoming the historian of her family and
mhm,
documenting everything and trying to collect everything. I just felt like I could relate to a lot of experiences that she
mhm,
had. I'm thinking one in particular when she is at Rutledge and it's her first semester there, and they are in Dr. Aludara's class. It was one of the first classes, and she was just kind of having these awakenings of,
mhm,
I guess, what history has been like for African Americans. And that was really like one of my experiences too in college. I took a Black experience class in America, and I've had like those similar awakenings to
mhm.
certain things. So I loved her as a character. I loved Lydia as a character, and that's why my heart hurt for her so much.
Mhm.
Um, One character though that I do find interesting and I kind of wish we had more time with was Coco.
Me too. Yeah.
I would have loved to see more from Coco.
I wanted to see like this like joyful queer love story that she seemed to be having in the background. Like I wanted to see more of that. I thought it would have been so lovely to have this like different way of love being shown.
Mhm.
Um, because she when she like pulls Ailey up on her being like wasting time and not doing anything and like not having a job and not going back to school or whatever. And she's like, yeah, we're like we're happy, we're having a good time over here. Like she just seems so much more self-composed than the others. Which I guess means she would have been less interesting maybe to follow, but I don't know. She was
I know. I really wish that we did. I love that moment because it was such a big sister moment. I felt
mm,
like, get your act
mm,
together. What are you doing? But yeah, you're right to have like that look into her love and her relationship. And I think that would have added an interesting dynamic because
mm,
religious people have often, so, but once again, I think that's kind of why she was more so not featured as much. But
mm,
she was so interesting, just even the way that she viewed their family. And she kind of always, like Lydia wanted to get away, but she was still very tied.
mm,
Coco got away and she never really seemed to want to return. It was
mm,
always if something, really called her back. She
yeah.
was on her own, in her own lane.
Mm,
Um, and she just seemed so strong-willed to me. So I feel like to have spent more time with her would have been awesome to
yeah.
see.
I feel like she
Mhm.
seemed like the most like she was the coolest one. She was the one who would be like the most fun to hang out with. I feel like she seemed just really like chill, and I like the way it said like, oh, our awkward sister, and then when she's with a pretty girl, suddenly she's like so suave. That's
Yes. I
what I
love
want to
that when,
see.
like, Lydia sees her at a party or wherever they are, and she's, like, talking to the girl, and she's like, "Oh my god, who is this? This is my sister." It's
Yeah.
like yeah, I agree. I would love to hang out with Coco. I think she would be fun. But when she asked to take Ailey out for a coffee, I'm like, "I would love to go for a coffee with you," and just, like talk about it and chill, and I don't know, I really, really liked her as a character too. I wish we would have gotten more time with her though.
Yeah, I agree. I thought
Um,
it was. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, was there a character that you struggled with? Like,
Andre, really, I mean, all of the men except for David that Haley dates seem to be. Well, I guess Pat was fine too, but like, there's there's all of the people who have. There's loads of men in this who are so difficult to understand. I find them difficult to understand. Like Andre and Tim, and they seem to be really similar characters, Andre and Tim, as far as I could tell. They both had really difficult childhoods in which their fathers were beat their mothers, and it was difficult for them, and they were really poor. And so that made them horrible people, which isn't true for the other people. And like take it out on these women in their lives who have had very similar experiences to them as children. And they perpetuate the abuse through it. But Andre, it's just the misogyny. Like, I thought that was really interesting, the way that the two different times that Ailey's at school. There's the time where she's at this all-black college, well, or historically black college, and she has to deal with so much misogyny in the classroom, and these men talking about women's place being in the home, and like how men are the head of the household and they have to do what they're told, and all of this. And then she goes to a predominantly white college, and she's like one of only two black people in the class, and she has to deal with these people being like, Mamie's loved being Mamie's. Like, I'm like, what? So she just, both times she had to deal with all of this like aggression towards her, so she couldn't be comfortable in academia, and there was so much fighting for her just to be in the classroom, just to deal with all of these people. There were so many misogynist men, and I thought that was an interesting. Andre, we saw him first, and then we saw her mother's experience with they weren't Black Panthers, but they were like Black Panther adjacent people, and the misogyny there as well. The guy, was he called Zulu? Who had like three women living together and still wanted her to cook all the meals. Like, that's the only thing she could bring to this meeting. He was like, don't talk about politics, just bring me chicken. I was like,
1000%. And like how it was okay for a man to have multiple wives, but like the women were expected to just subject themselves to this. I agree. And I feel like one character that really, really captured that like 80s, 90s, early 2000s misogyny was Abdul. I'm pretty sure that was his name. She gets into that discussion with him where he's like, no, women are, supposed to cook and the man provides. Yeah. And I just cannot believe that she got into a relationship with him. I'm like, what is going on here?
I was like, that this man is terrible. You're like a feminist and you disagree with him, and yet because a woman was mean to you, you have to now sleep with this horrible man. It doesn't make sense.
Oh my god, that was like such an infuriating part for me. I'm like, Ailey, you're so much better than this, please. And it was just like, I really disliked him as a character. Of course, I disliked all of basically.
I think I was confused. I think I was talking about Andre, but his name was Abdul. I think I was talking about the same
person. Okay, yeah, no, there are so many men. It's like hard to keep track of all of their names. And you're right, how they are kind of like this representation of misogyny for whatever time period. It's so similar that they're kind of blending together in my head right now. I think
there's like repetition in the way that her and her mum experienced things when they were going to college as well. Like, I think they have the same experiences with the same kind of man, and it's like, how much have people actually moved on? How much has actually changed?
Exactly. Yeah, or the ways in which there is change, but it's still, prevalent or like manifesting itself in a similar way. It was interesting too, even thinking of like systemic misogyny with the college, with Rutledge College, and how when her mom was there, it was like a very strict dress code for women. You had to wear skirts below your knee, and it was just a very, very tight, whereas the men were just kind of allowed to do their own thing. And even just with the dean or the president of the college, and how only the two sisters who were the founders were in a leadership position. And then ever since then, or I believe they had like one other woman, and then ever since then it was like all male, even though it started out as a college for women.
Yeah, and it was still like 80% women, but no women in power.
Exactly. So it was interesting to me how like Ailey saw all of this and she would call them out. Like she was totally unafraid of voicing this and putting, you know, this to their attention. But then she ends up with, you know, Abdul. So I don't, it was very, very, even in the way that she perpetuates misogyny without even realizing it. I think that's what that relationship showed us, because you're right. It was because she was thinking of pledging and joining a sorority, and then the girl pissed her off. So she did that to get back at her.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And her mum talks about that too, about how her anger could be for the other women, how when someone cheats on her, the anger is always for the other women. And in the South, there is this idea that men just do cheat. Men are cheaters, that's what they are. But the other woman, and you're virtuous if someone cheats against you. But if you're the person someone cheats with, then you're like the Jezebel, essentially. Which, yeah, there was a lot of that, like, even though people chafe against it when it happens to them, they can't help doing it, perpetuating it when it happens to other people, which I thought was, yeah.
Exactly. And even just, I believe it was the pastor who died at some point in the novel. And
he was the one who had the grits thrown on it.
I'm sorry?
He was the one who had the grits thrown at him.
Yes. And he became a changed man, and he came to Jesus and all of these things. And then Ailey and Miss Ailey's mother and grandmother are talking of his wife and saying, oh, she was so patient. God bless her. And, you know, it was because she decided to stay with him despite you know, all of his cheating and doing what he was doing. And just, it was interesting how they viewed her. And then they said, oh my goodness, how dare they come to, you know, his funeral for whichever women were there. That was another example of how that is right. Like how women's virtue is seen and interpreted through their actions or inactions, particularly in the way in which like they deal with their men.
I thought it was interesting, like, because it's so focused in the African American experience, it goes into so much detail about like the inter African American like ranking and like hierarchies within African American people. Like there was a lot of classism going on, like how A's mum didn't like Lydia's husband. Was that Andre? Lydia's husband, because he was like, he didn't have good grammar, and he like spoke in African American vernacular English, and so he wasn't speaking correctly, and like so he wasn't okay. And then she thought that someone else was okay, even though they'd done something terrible. I can't remember what it was, but she was like, but they were well to do, so it was okay. Like they were more respected, because there was a lot of classism going on throughout it, because like A's from a fairly well-to-do family, and so with like grandparents who went to college and stuff, which is obviously pretty rare. And so the way that she looks down on like poor Black people, I thought was well integrated into the novel, like throughout it. And then also this idea of being color struck was very repeated throughout the novel. Sort of every single person in here, their skin, their hair, and their eyes are described, and it's all sort of, it shows you how their experience is different, I guess, based on that, the interactions. But it seems to be particularly like within the Black community more than how, because once they're outside of the Black community, they're seen as Black regardless of that color,
Exactly.
colorism. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it's very difficult because you're right. It's always this strive to, I guess, assert your place in society, being a people that have been traditionally violently excluded from partaking in that. So within the Black community, this well-to-do, you know, it is a privilege to have relatives who went to college and who are educated, the fact that Ailey's father is a doctor and her mother is a teacher, even the colorism aspect too. And you're right, it's kind of this like striving towards whiteness in a way, or towards a way that kind of separates you from your heritage, your African ancestry, which we know is internalized, and it's at the hand of, once again, these features that are craved for. And even the men were like, oh, she's so attractive, she has light skin, she has long hair. To them, it's the internalized racism that they have, which, I've experienced. I've overheard people, it isn't until recently, I want to say, in like probably the later end of the early 2000s, that people began really addressing colorism within the Black community, and like texturism, which, once again, as we know, it all stems from slavery and what features were considered, even going back to like who was allowed to work at the big house versus who was in the fields. It all had to do with, but we know those people who got those features were often at the hand of violence from, the white masters that were taking advantage.
I thought that was well done in the book, actually, because earlier on, there's a lot of talk about color and texture and all that sort of thing, to the point where I was like, okay, I get it, but it's a lot. You're talking about it a lot. And then as we get further on, we start to see more and more of like this family in particular, and the ways that like violence and rape is perpetuated through the family. And the reason that there is so much color variation within this family is a lot to do with their history. And so it becomes like tied to that. So it's like, it started off just being the family in the 80s and 90s, but it's linked back to their history and things. And I thought it was, it worked well. It kind of came around again, because I was like, this is, it's a lot to begin with, the way it's absolutely everyone all of the time. I guess maybe that's just because it's completely outside of my experience, so I don't think about that sort of thing.
No, it's so true.
I guess it's like in the UK, as white people in the UK, noticing someone's accent, like the slight variations of someone's accent to tell you their class. I guess it's a similar, like, you would always notice someone's class without even like consciously registering that. And I don't know if that's like a similar corollary.
No, I can see how that is similar. And even considering, back, like I love using Rutledge College as an example in their history. The moment in the novel where Ailey goes to their hall of, I guess, founders, or I'm forgetting the name, and she sees all of the former students who went to this historically Black college, and most of them are fair and could be white passing. And she's like, she makes that observation, like, kind of what is going on here. And even from the president, who has this desire to be more appealing to people outside of, African American ancestry. And yeah, there's a lot of things too that, the Black community has done to give more privileges to those who have these lighter features or a higher class standing, as a way, once again, I think, to just really kind of, I think it stems from wanting to it's self-hate, it's internalized racism, it's so many things that I feel like Black people were feeling as though they had to prove themselves all of the time, which is what we even see with Ailey in all of her academic interactions. She's like constantly fighting, constantly proving, no, I'm not just here because of affirmative action. Like, I'm actually smart. I'm actually brilliant. I put in the work. Yeah. And she has people make these comments like, well, she's just the one to fill in the
the quota.
requirement.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and even her mentors are both like the black professors that she works with are like, yeah, you just have to push through and work harder, and they won't recognize it, but you have to do it like if you want to stay here, you have to have tough skin and hard work.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? I
And
can't remember
even
what it
now,
was.
sorry, while you think of it,
Yeah.
I saw this graphic, it was data that one of a professor in poetry that I've like worked with outside who posted she just became a tenured professor, and it was the stats of like African American women
Mm,
who are professors in academia, and it was just such a low amount. I want to say it was like 5%
mm,
are like Black women.
yeah.
So it was, I just saw that while reading this book, and I was like, oh my God, even now in
Mhm.
this year of 2024, there's still like this imbalance of, you know, and, women are educated. Like people are
Mhm.
going out there getting their masters, but for
Mhm.
whatever reason, it seems as though, there's like a little more of a fight, I guess, to get
Yeah,
that like tenure status or professorship.
I'm sure
Um,
I've seen statistics somewhere that said that like Black American women are like the highest educated proportionally of any people in America, and yet not getting up the ladder in that way.
exactly.
Yeah.
So,
The guy that Alia has an affair with, I thought that he was a really interesting character looking at this like intersection of racism and misogyny as well. Like misogynoir was the way that he, and it was an experience that she'd had. It mirrored that experience she had at school where she dated the black guy who had a white girlfriend. I can't remember his name, but it
mhm.
happened to her again later on. The way that he wanted to be like, he seemed more into her in a way. Obviously, we didn't see him with his racist girlfriend. We didn't see them interacting, but I can't believe how racist she was, like outwardly, whilst he would still be with someone who was like that clearly racist. Like her parents were obviously even more racist because they wanted her to divorce him. But anyway, it seemed like having a white girlfriend was like a status thing. Like for him, it gave him some sort of. But he would tell Ailey to be nice to her, and like he was like, "Oh, this is why I don't want to be with a black woman. There's so much drama." And it's like everyone's being horrible to her. Obviously, she's gonna be like react to that. I thought it was So this was in like 2000, like in the 21st century as well. This was happening, and I was like, again, it's like those repeated like everything keeps coming back, and it's the same. This guy that wanted to have sex with you under the bleachers, but didn't want to be out in public with you, and now you've got this other man who wants to have an affair with you, but also wants you to come to dinner with his racist wife.
I know. And it was always like, you're right. That was a really, really interesting relationship for Ailey. And I feel like I'm kind of struggling with making sense of it and how she keeps ending up in these. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's kind of that like close proximity to not really having many other Black students in her master's
Mm-hmm.
program. So wanting that connection and that kinship culturally.
Mm-hmm.
And so she wants to befriend him, but
Mm-hmm.
he starts like unveiling the ways in which he's complicit with his racist wife and his racist, her family,
Mm-hmm.
and how he kind of just lets it slide and wants Ailey to also be that way, where she
Mm-hmm.
was always an outspoken character, when it came to things like this. She's a
Mm-hmm.
feminist. And so to ask her to go to their dinner after having an affair, even beforehand, he wanted to like force this relationship. And even Rebecca suggested, like, oh, why don't you invite her to dinner? At least that's what he told her.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what he told Ailey. So it was just a very, very weird, I don't know.
Mm.
It was hard for me to make sense of all of that. But you're right. It was. once again, he wanted that access to Ailey and to her
Mhm,
Black womanhood,
mhm.
to her like cooking and all of these things, but she was never good enough for him to marry or
Mhm.
for him to, want to be seen out with her. Similarly to her high school boyfriend or whoever, forgetting
Yeah,
his name too.
it seems to happen a lot for the women characters in this book, that
Mhm.
they are expected to do so much care labor, and how that, like, I guess, links back to their ancestors who were working in the big house doing this care labor throughout their lives. And even then, it's Rebecca's like, well, their care labor, they wanted to do it. It's what they want to do. And the men are like, women are meant to be caring. They're meant to be in the house. This is what you're meant to do. And this feeling for both Lydia and Ailey and their mum, who wanted to be a history professor and ends up pregnant and not able to do that. This feeling of constantly being told that that's what you're supposed to do. So feeling, it's like, it feels like they don't want to do it and they try and fight against it, but then when people ask them a specific task, then they're like, well, I have to do that task, I can't say no. And they'll like rail against the idea of it. But if someone wants you to fix them a plate, you fix them a plate. Like, it seems like they can't stand up on an interpersonal level in the same way that they can notice it on a structural level.
Mm.
Which I thought was, I mean, very true. Like, it's when you love someone or you care about someone, or there's that social interaction that you've had your home training, or there's whatever, to mean that you can't, in the moment, you can't stand up in the way that you, if you were being your best self, you would, in your idealized self, you would be able to stand up. But in this moment, there's something like, it's not, you can't manage it. And I thought that that made them all very human.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And even with the connection to Zora Neale Hurston, I'm even seeing her influence more now because if I think of Janie Crawford and Their Eyes Are Watching God, there's so many instances where she is also disrespected in front
Mhm.
of people, but because she's married to that man, she kind of just has to take it.
Mhm.
And then she deals with it in her own way behind closed doors,
Mhm.
um, which is what Ailey's mother does or
Mhm.
did, particularly with the father, except for that one time where she actually confronted him in front of everyone. I feel like
Yeah.
that was the main thing where we saw a character do something like that so publicly,
Mhm. Yeah.
which
And yeah, it was so interesting because all of these people that she was in front of him had all this progressive politics, and yet in the home they still expected the same thing, and
Mhm.
they were like shocked by her. But I enjoyed that
Oh
moment.
yeah, it just went against that
Yeah, I
home
thought she
training
was.
and that idea of like keeping everything within your family. And she's like, no, she basically has
Mhm.
like I guess even for her, she was very respectable the entire time. I guess she was so fed up with it, she didn't care anymore because she knew that everyone else was talking about it anyway. It was kind of
Mhm.
like, why are
Yeah.
people spreading these rumors? Like it's obvious what's happening, everyone knows, so I might as well
Mhm.
address it in front of everyone
Mhm. But
and
she
lay it
still
all
like
out.
put on her pantyhose and wore her like right clothes to go and do this thing.
Yes.
She was still looking as respectable as possible, properly
Mhm.
dressed. Yeah, I think I would have liked to see a more expansive part of that as well. That era, I guess the sort of the '60s era of the civil rights movement being more like, it was obviously, it was there in a bit, but it was because her mother hadn't had a direct experience. She had an experience that was adjacent to it because I guess it was interesting when she called home during the, was it as after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, and she called
Mhm.
home and she'd noticed the change in black people in the city, and she called home and they were like, why would you call yourself black? That's not a nice thing to call anyone. Like, they were still very old fashioned. They hadn't changed their way of thinking. I thought that that was interesting to see, like the slower movement of it. But I think it would have been interesting as well to see um, a bigger part of that, I don't know, coming out a bit more, because I did feel like the eras kind of bled into one. I couldn't tell what time period it was a lot of the time.
Exactly, and I agree. That would be, I guess, my main critique is I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I would have liked there was a very strong historical context when it came to kind of like the pre-slavery, during slavery, and shortly thereafter, kind of like Reconstruction,
Mhm.
post-slavery, but kind of a lack of that stronger historical context when it came to like the civil rights movement
Mhm.
and how that changed everything. I did feel like they glossed over it a little bit with, the assassination, and then
Mhm.
also of Martin Luther King Jr. And then also, you're right, like her father and mother being in this Black Panther-esque
Mhm.
kind of like, I'm forgetting the exact name, but there are a lot of groups that actually popped up along that time with the same ideologies of,
Like
let's
mutual aid and all that.
exactly, like returning
Mhm.
back to Africa,
Mhm.
or, this hyper masculine approach to trying to, be a Black person living in
Yeah,
America.
like Marcus Garvey, kind of that kind of influence.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I thought that could have been explored more. The other thing that I would critique slightly is the part that was during from pre-slavery through to the Civil War. Um, I could not keep straight who everyone was in my head. I was like, I don't know who this person is, how they are related to this other person. There are so many names. There are so many people. I am confused.
Mhm. I would agree too. I kind of wish we had like a family
Mm,
map or like a family history chart, something
yeah.
to go along with it, because it was super confusing, especially once we got into like the nitty-gritty of their family history.
Hmm.
I was like trying to keep track of, okay, this is so and so's great great grandmother, and
Hmm.
it was
And
a
because
lot.
everyone had like three names as well. They would be like this name, but then also this nickname, and then losing. Yeah, yeah. I thought I was like so confused.
I agree. And I got confused when it came to like Rabbit, the twins. Were there two
Hmm.
sets of twins? And then one, they like something happened to the first set. It was a little confusing to me too during that time. I was like, okay, I'm getting a little bit in like stuck in the weeds here with
Yeah.
all of the names and
I was kind of like,
um,
okay, they're just representative of an idea of what happened in this time period. I'm just going to go with it. I'm not going to remember who's mum and like who's cousin, because they're all marrying their cousins and everything anyway. So everything gets like crossed over.
exactly. That was my same thought too. I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna look at this from the standpoint of like this represents something, or this is
Hmm.
supposed to be symbolic of whatever is going on currently
Hmm.
in their family. But yeah, I would agree. I felt a little overwhelmed at times with just the amount of family history we're getting, like the information
Hmm.
and names.
I also felt like the earlier songs that were about like the Creek people felt a little less fleshed out, a little more thin. And I guess I mean it's a bit more about African American history rather than an Indigenous history. So I guess that bit, even though there are Indigenous people in this family, it's obviously more focused on an African American family history. But yeah, I did feel like the earlier songs, I was a bit like, we're going through this very fast, and I don't really think these people are very fleshed out. But um, I kind of understood why it was important to have that as part of the history as well.
Mhm.
I just felt like that could have been, I guess, but also I guess there's not the same archival research possibility because it's a pre writing culture. Like there isn't written records left of that time. So I guess that makes sense as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, is there anything else you wanted to add? I think I've gone through all the things on my list.
Just one thing that I wanted to point out that I found interesting in the story was kind of this need to like cleanse oneself after doing a deep
Mm-hmm.
dive of familial history. And um, I noticed that was a major theme to kind of once we are accessing these histories, how do we then, they're so heavy, and how do
Mm-hmm.
we then kind of, I don't want to say rid ourselves, that's not the correct terminology, but just kind of like wash over
Mm-hmm.
those feelings. And um, that particularly stuck out to me because in my family, as I said before, that I have family in the South, so I've been to family reunions, and one that really sticks out to me is one time we were at the church of my family that has they've been going to for generations, and I'm forgetting the exact name of this um, exercise, almost ritual, but and there are a few too that we do in Kwanzaa, but we all kind of joined hands and it was like a swaying and you're just kind of people are making sounds and it just felt so ancestral to me to be a part of
Mhm.
that. So to see examples of that in the novel as well with like Dr. Aludara, she takes them out into the field and she's like, take off your shoes, wear all white. And
Mhm.
then she even encourages Ailey as she's conducting her research to make sure that she like takes a shower and wears white before she goes to sleep. And then that one night, the first night where Ailey doesn't listen and she has this like guttural reaction literally
Mhm.
to all of the things that she's witnessed because the through line of this novel was just kind of once again like how history and ancestry is passed down through us through our blood,
Mhm.
and I thought that was a really really well executed part of the novel that would be in my praise box of this
Yeah.
story of things done well, that remembrance of yes, these are heavy stories, and this is how you can deal with it in a more
Mm.
like spiritual ancestral way. um, there's even another exercise during Kwanzaa where you kind of just take a minute, everyone's quiet, and then you call out to your ancestors. So you would, name whoever has gone and
Mhm.
passed. And it's even more powerful when you're in a room full of people that you don't know.
Mhm.
And this is happening, and you start feeling like a kind of like spiritual connection to people through this. So I feel as though that has always been important to, particularly in the Black community, this very
Mhm.
like spiritual side of things. And even the kind of paradox of there being enslaved Christians, because oftentimes um, slavery was justified through the use of the Bible and through the use of Christianity.
Yeah.
So I think those aspects too were I appreciated seeing that represented in the stories
Mm.
as well.
Yeah, because it could very easily have become academic towards the end and like thinking through your stories or like making the experience purely research and academia, but she showed the ways that those things are physical and spiritual as well as purely like mental and academic, um,
Mhm.
and the emotional reaction to the stories and things. Yeah, I definitely saw that as well as a powerful moment in the story. Even the ancestors, the part that made me cry in this book is when Lydia dies and her dad's there and her great grandma's there and her dead husband is there as well, and they're all like waiting for her to welcome her. Like,
Mhm.
they all the funerals are called homegoings in the book, aren't they?
Yes.
And it felt like that was sort of a spiritual representation of the idea of homegoing, as well.
Yes. And I'm happy you brought that up because going to Lydia's funeral and then even her line sisters and her sorority showing up. And that scene too, I was just crying throughout those few
Mm-hmm.
chapters because
Right.
it was such a tragic thing that happened, but the
Mm-hmm.
ways in which Lydia was, celebrated through her homegoing, and that is
Mm-hmm.
always a thing too in the Black community. When someone passes away, we still to this day call it a homegoing, and it is more so viewed as a celebration of their life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too that reminds me of the comment on dreams and how they're represented.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was something Ailey after Lydia's death kind of has a dream of Lydia coming to her when she's
Mm-hmm.
in the bathtub and she's thinking of like
Yeah.
self-harming. And she's like, I'm going to take this from you now. She like
Mm.
took the blade from her, and she's like, you have to keep going.
Yeah.
So, you know, once again, those kind of other dimensional
Mm.
connections that we have to our ancestors and dreams. And even Illy's mom was always like, I had a dream that you were dating this guy, or I had a
Yes.
bad dream about that guy. You need to, she always had this like foresight to this
I wondered how many of those dreams were like she actually had a bad dream, and how many
ex-
of them were like she didn't like that man. It's just like,
exactly. Probably not all of them. She's probably like, I just don't like him. He didn't speak proper grammar to me,
yeah.
so I'm over him. But yeah, that was those like little moments too were fun
Mm.
to read, and I think really, really cool. And
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah,
no,
it's
really
I've always enjoyed reading about representations of like death and funerals. I know that that's really morbid, but there's something like culturally interesting about the way that people deal with death differently throughout the world. Like I live in the UK, which is very like hush hush about death and very quiet about death, but my family are Irish, which is an entirely different thing when it comes to death. Like someone has to be buried within 3 days of dying. Like they don't stick around and they stay in the house. So the body is in the house. You wake the body. Everyone comes round to see the body, and then you talk. And there's like refreshments, and everyone comes to like hang out with the body. Because if I think it's because like Jesus woke up after 3 days, so you have to make sure that they're not going to like rise.
oh, wow.
So you have to stay with them for 3 days while they're awake. And then there's this thing called keening, which people don't do as much anymore, but it's this like women do this like really, it's really horrible when you hear it, this like heartrending cry over the bodies of the dead as they walk. And it's really interesting to hear. It's really like moving, this sort of
Yeah.
screaming. And then there's also the thing about Halloween, which is on Halloween is the last day of the year. In Ireland, in like pagan Ireland, it's the last day of the year, and that means that the like wall between the worlds is thin. So everyone who died that year is going to travel on into the next world, into Tir na Og, and you have to scare off any like fairies or whatever that are going to try and take the people away, and that's why you dress up. And so yeah, Irish people are obsessed with death. Like it's like a massive death cult, and I think that's why I'm like really always really interested in reading about how people deal with death.
Yeah. I think too for Black Americans as well, like there's always this keeping up with who has gone on, who's passed away. That's often shared all of the time too, like even in my family group chats, like my grandma texts, so she'll be like, hey, so and so passed away, or like so it's like always this acknowledgement too. And then once again, very similar tradition in terms of like mourning when it comes to visiting the body, having a funeral, having songs, and it's testimonies and sharing. And then we also have refreshments afterwards as well, and that is called a repast. So that's when you would eat like traditional foods in Black culture, like collard greens and sweet potato pie and all of these things. And it's a way to like come together in fellowship too. Yeah, it really depends, I think, more so regionally. But the scenes of like grieving and death that we represented here are definitely very, very Southern, like through and through. I think of like stories my grandmother has told me of her relatives passing away, and it's all very similar, whether it's in a church or, just like a family church. So it is interesting. And, it's like our last way of kind of sending them off, which is why we call it a homegoing.
Yeah, yeah, I like that phrase. I thought it's a good phrase for it. I also thought the way that food was so important in this book, and the connection with food and the representations of food, and even to the extent like the tree that Uncle Root is nearly lynched on is a pecan tree. Like they still go back to the pecan tree, and they talk about pecans as being part of the food that enslaved people ate when they were enslaved. Like, and then pecan pies and things are still used throughout. I thought it was, that's sort of still a linking to history and a linking to place that was very specific, I thought. I think that's true of a lot of books like this, like Pachinko or whatever. The representation of food is always seems to be really important when you are talking about ancestry.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or even just how if Lydia and their mom were at odds, she would always bring a pie as kind of like this peace offering or this way to like rebuild a bond or to fix what's broken in a way. So yes, food is absolutely important, and especially considering like the context of what enslaved people could eat, could not eat, the foods that they were given, and the ways in which, soul food, and even think back to like Ailey always going to like the rib shack or just
The
to get that
crust
connection.
or something.
Yes, yeah. Just to feel like that kinship and connection to her culture. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it was really well done, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that is everything I have to add, unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about. But I think
No, I think we got to everything.
okay, great. So just to remind you, next time in June and July, we will be reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, which is a big old fantasy book, so entirely outside of my comfort zone, but I've heard good things. So hopefully it will be an enjoyable read. So I'll probably see you in early August with that. And thank you, Ebony. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. It's really nice to talk to you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I have enjoyed this entire experience. I loved reading this book and then having the chance to talk to you about it. So thank you.
It's great. And thank you to everyone who watched. And we'll see you again soon. Oh, and check out Ebony if you haven't already. Bye-bye.
Bye.
There we go.